Chapter 1. The Whisper at Willow Cottage. The village of Little Mayfield was a picture of quiet charm, nestled between rolling green hills and old oak-lined lanes. It was the sort of place where time moved at a leisurely pace, where the most pressing concerns of the day often revolved around whose roses had bloomed the brightest, or whether the vicar's sermon had run a little too long. The village thrived on routine, and its people took comfort in the familiar rhythm of their lives. But on this particular morning, something was amiss. The early April sun filtered through the ancient trees, casting long dappled shadows over the thatched cottages that lined the high street. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from Mrs. Harper's bakery, mingling with the faint, ever-present aroma of damp earth. Birds chirped merrily in the hedgerows, oblivious to the undercurrent of unease beginning to ripple through the village. The heart of this picturesque scene stood Willow Cottage, a quaint whitewashed house with ivy creeping up its walls, and a bright blue front door that had always seemed to Miss Marple rather cheerful. It belonged to Mrs. Letitia Blackwell, a widow of some 15 years, known for her sharp wit, formidable presence, and an unwavering commitment to routine. Mrs. Blackwell was a woman of habits. Every morning, precisely at 7, she would collect the milk from her doorstep, open her curtains, and set about airing out the house. By 7:30, she would be seen in her front garden, clipping away at the roses with precise, practised hands. At 8, she took breakfast, always at the same place by the window, always with a single slice of toast and marmalade. By 9, she would step out for her customary walk through the village, a cane tapping lightly on the cobbled path as she made her rounds. It was a routine as reliable as the church bells on Sunday, and yet, on this morning, something was different. Miss Marple, on her way to visit her dear friend Mrs. Winifred Hartley, happened to glance toward Willow Cottage. Her sharp, bird-like eyes noticed the first discrepancy at once. The windows were shut tight. That was unusual. Mrs. Blackwell believed firmly in fresh air, and always kept at least one window slightly open, no matter the weather. Then there was the front gate. It stood closed. Normally, it was left just a fraction ajar, as though inviting visitors in. A small thing, perhaps, but Miss Marple had long since learned that the smallest things were often the most telling. She paused for a moment, her gloved fingers tightening slightly on the handle of her handbag. There was an unnatural stillness about the cottage, a hush that unsettled her. She had seen this sort of quiet before, the kind that settled over a place where something had gone terribly wrong. She was not the only one who had noticed. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple caught sight of 2 familiar figures standing near the edge of the village green. Mrs. Holloway, the vicar's wife, and Miss Lydia Parsons, the postmistress, were deep in conversation, their voices low and urgent. Both women, well versed in the art of village gossip, had expressions that spoke of unease. "They say she never opened the door this morning," Mrs. Holloway whispered, glancing around as if to ensure they were not overheard. Miss Parsons nodded, her usually rosy face a shade paler. "And her curtains never moved, not a single flicker. You know how particular she is about her routine." Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice further. "The milk is still on her doorstep." Miss Marple, standing just within earshot, did not interrupt. Instead, She listened, carefully, thoughtfully. A milk bottle left untouched, curtains that remained drawn. A silence hanging about the house like an unspoken warning. Miss Parsons hesitated before adding, "Do you think we ought to, check on her?" Mrs. Holloway looked positively scandalized. "We can't just go barging into her home," she said, though there was an undeniable edge of curiosity in her voice. Miss Marple, ever composed, took a gentle step forward. "Perhaps," she said pleasantly, "we might inquire with young Peter." Peter was the village's errand boy, known for running messages and odd jobs. If anyone had seen Mrs. Blackwell that morning, it would be him. The women turned at the sound of Miss Marple's voice, their expressions shifting from surprise to relief. Miss Marple had that effect on people. She was, after all, a fixture of the village, an unassuming elderly lady with a gentle smile, an unshakable composure, and a mind sharper than most gave her credit for. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there," Mrs. Holloway said, offering a flustered smile. "Yes, Peter would know, wouldn't he?" As it happened, Peter was just then dashing past on his bicycle, a loaf of bread balanced precariously in his basket. At the sight of the 3 women waving him down, he skidded to a halt, his freckled face curious. "Peter, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you wouldn't happen to have seen Mrs. Blackwell this morning, would you?" Peter furrowed his brow, thinking. "No, miss. Didn't see her when I dropped off the paper. Thought it was odd, though. The paper's still there. She usually takes it in quick as a flash." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Mrs. Holloway and Miss Parsons, another detail added to the growing puzzle. "Well," said Mrs. Parsons after a moment, "someone ought to knock." There was a pause. The villagers of Little Mayfield were many things, curious, talkative, fond of speculation, but they were also deeply respectful of privacy. It was one thing to gossip about Mrs. Blackwell's absence, quite another to intrude upon her home uninvited. Finally, it was Mrs. Holloway who took a hesitant step forward. I suppose just a gentle knock wouldn't hurt. The 3 women walked up to Willow Cottage, Miss Marple trailing just slightly behind, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Holloway rapped smartly on the door. Silence, Miss Parsons cleared her throat and knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. The hush around the cottage seemed to deepen. A soft breeze rustled the ivy climbing the walls, and in the distance a church bell chimed the 1/4 hour. Miss Marple felt it then, a subtle shift in the air, the unmistakable weight of something wrong. It was Miss Parsons who finally reached for the doorknob. "Mrs. Blackwell," she called, "are you in there?" The door swung open. The 3 women gasped. The interior of Willow Cottage was dim, the curtains still drawn, casting long shadows over the sitting room. And there, just beyond the threshold, lay Mrs. Letitia Blackwell. Her body was sprawled on the carpet, utterly still. A single delicate china teacup lay shattered beside her hand. And in the quiet hush of Willow Cottage, a whisper of death lingered. In the air. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The news spread through Little Mayfield like wildfire. Within an hour of the grim discovery at Willow Cottage, the entire village seemed to be humming with hushed voices and anxious speculation. The details were scarce, But that never stopped the villagers from filling in the blanks with their own theories. Miss Marple had not lingered after Mrs. Blackwell's body was found. Instead, she had stepped back, allowing Mrs. Holloway and Miss Parsons to handle the inevitable panic. She knew there was little to be gained from the initial chaos. This was a time when emotions ran high, and facts were easily distorted. Still, her mind was already at work. By mid-morning, the village green had become an unspoken gathering place for hushed conversations. Mr. Albert Pritchard, the village grocer, stood outside his shop, arms crossed as he spoke to Reverend Clement, the vicar, who looked particularly pale. "Terrible business," Mr. Pritchard muttered, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day. Letitia Blackwell, of all people. Who'd want to harm an old woman like her?" Reverend Clement sighed, his fingers nervously adjusting the sleeves of his cassock. "It's a tragedy, Albert, a tragedy. But we mustn't jump to conclusions." Mr. Pritchard gave a snort. "Jump to conclusions? There ain't many conclusions to jump to, Reverend. People don't just fall down dead with a look of horror on their face." The Reverend flinched slightly at the words. Though no official statement had been made, it was already common knowledge that Mrs. Blackwell's body had been found in an unusual state. She had been lying near her sitting-room doorway, her features frozen in what could only be described as a look of wide-eyed shock. The shattered teacup at her side had only added to the speculation. Some whispered that she had been poisoned. Others swore they had heard strange noises near Willow Cottage the previous night. A few even claimed she had been involved in some mysterious business long ago, something that had finally caught up with her. Miss Marple knew better than to put much stock in idle gossip, but she also knew that rumours, however exaggerated, often contained a kernel of truth. She had spent much of the morning in quiet observation. She had taken tea with Mrs. Hartley, who had been shaken but eager to share her thoughts. Letitia wasn't an easy woman, Mrs. Hartley had admitted, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigour. Sharp as a blade, that one. Never hesitated to speak her mind, you know. Miss Marple nodded. "Did she have enemies?" Mrs. Hartley pursed her lips. "Enemies? Oh, I wouldn't say enemies exactly, but she had a way of rubbing people the wrong way. Last week, for instance, she had a rather public disagreement with Mr. Lawrence Simmons. You know, the landlord of the Three Hounds. Miss Marple did know. Mr. Simmons was a stout, red-faced man with a tendency to argue, particularly when he had been drinking. What was the disagreement about? Oh, some nonsense about noise, I believe. Letitia claimed the pub had been playing music too loudly in the evenings. She stormed in there and gave Lawrence a thorough scolding. Quite the scene, I heard. Miss Marple filed the information away. It was hardly a motive for murder, but tempers could flare over the smallest things. Later, during a brief stop at the bakery, she had overheard a rather different theory from Miss Beatrice Henderson, the schoolteacher. "You mark my words," Miss Henderson had said, eyes gleaming with certainty. "It's about money. It always is." Miss Marple had looked at her with mild curiosity. "You think so?" Miss Henderson had nodded firmly. Letitia Blackwell wasn't as rich as people like to think, but she was comfortable. No children, no close family left. Who inherits, I wonder? Miss Marple had wondered the same thing. By noon, Inspector Graves had arrived from the neighbouring town, bringing with him an air of authority and a small team of policemen. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deep, steady voice and a no-nonsense approach to investigations. He wasted little time in gathering statements. Standing outside Willow Cottage, he addressed a small group of villagers who had gathered nearby. "I understand Mrs. Blackwell was found early this morning," he said, his tone measured. "I need to know, did anyone see or hear anything unusual last night?" A murmur ran through the crowd. "I heard a noise," said old Tom Briggs, the village handyman, scratching his chin. "Something like a scrape. Maybe a chair. Moving. Around midnight it was." Inspector Graves made a note. "Did you see anything?" Tom shook his head. "Nah, didn't think much of it at the time." Another voice piped up. "I saw a light in her window," said Mrs. Radcliffe, the seamstress. "Later than usual. She's not one to stay up late." The inspector turned to Miss Marple. "And you, Miss Marple, you were among the first to find her." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Yes, Inspector. I happened to be passing by when I heard Mrs. Holloway and Miss Parsons discussing her absence." "Did you notice anything unusual prior to that?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Only small things. The milk left untouched, curtains drawn late into the morning, little signs that something was not as it should be." Inspector Graves regarded her thoughtfully. "I see. Well, we'll be conducting a full examination of the house. In the meantime, I'd advise everyone to remain cautious." A ripple of unease spread through the villagers. Murders did not happen in Little Mayfield. It was the sort of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbours trusted one another implicitly. But today, that trust had been shaken. Miss Marple, watching the crowd carefully, noted the shifting expressions. Some faces were merely curious, others genuinely shaken, and then there were those that seemed troubled. She made a quiet note of them. She did not yet know who had killed Mrs. Blackwell, but she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the answer lay within the village, and she intended to find it. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The next morning, the village of Little Mayfield remained unsettled. Overnight, Willow Cottage had transformed from a quaint home to the scene of an ominous mystery. The presence of the police, the sealed-off sitting room, and the hushed conversations around town all contributed to a sense of unease that had not been felt in years, if ever. Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew that now was the time to listen. Not to the authorities. They would follow their own methods, searching for clear-cut evidence. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth of a crime often lay not in fingerprints or footprints, but in the small, unnoticed inconsistencies in human behaviour. And so she settled herself at the Bluebell Tea Room, a favourite haunt of the villagers, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea. She had barely placed her order when Miss Lydia Parsons, the postmistress, entered, her expression bright with curiosity. "Miss Marple, I was just thinking of you," Miss Parsons said, taking a seat uninvited. Miss Marple smiled gently. "How very kind, my dear. A busy morning at the post office, I expect." Miss Parsons sighed. "Oh, you wouldn't believe it. Everyone's Been coming in, asking about letters and wills and all sorts of things as if I'd have the answers. But between you and me, I do know one thing." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. "Mrs. Blackwell posted a letter just the evening, before she died." Miss Marple's hands remained steady as she stirred her tea. "Did she now? How interesting." Miss Parsons nodded, clearly pleased to be the bearer of news. And it wasn't one of her usual correspondences either. She rarely wrote letters, you know. But this one was sent to a solicitor in London. A solicitor. That was interesting indeed. Miss Marple made a mental note. If Mrs. Blackwell had contacted a solicitor the night before her death, it could only mean that something of legal importance had been on her mind. A change in her will, perhaps. A pressing concern. Just as Miss Marple was mulling this over, Reverend Clement entered the tea-room, his face lined with concern. He approached her table and offered a small nod. "Miss Marple, may I join you?" "Course, Reverend," she said warmly, gesturing to the seat across from her. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Terrible business, all this. The village is in a state of shock." Miss Marple regarded him carefully. "Indeed, you knew Mrs. Blackwell well, I believe." The Reverend hesitated, as well as anyone could know her. She was a woman of strong opinions, but she had her share of troubles too. Miss Marple waited patiently. She had long understood that people often revealed more if given the space to do so. Sure enough, the Reverend continued. "She came to me not long ago, you know. Seemed troubled. She spoke of feeling watched." Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, but her mind sharpened. "Did she say by whom?" The Reverend shook his head. "No, just that she had a feeling, an unpleasant one. I tried to reassure her, of course, but now, in light of everything—" He trailed off, looking troubled. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. She knew better than to dismiss such concerns. An old woman feeling watched. Was it paranoia? Or had she truly noticed something amiss before her death? The tea-room door swung open again, this time admitting Detective Inspector Graves. He was not a man prone to idle chatter, and his presence immediately silenced the murmurs around the room. His gaze landed on Miss Marple, and after a brief nod to the Reverend, he approached her table. "Miss Marple, may I have a word?" She set down her teacup. "Of course, Inspector." He pulled up a chair, his expression unreadable. "You were one of the first to see Mrs. Blackwell yesterday morning. I wanted to ask, what do you make of it?" Miss Marple gave him a polite smile. "Why, Inspector, that is your domain, surely." Graves exhaled sharply. "Yes, but I know you have an eye for these things, so humour me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Very well. There are a few things that seem odd. The milk left untouched. The curtains drawn later than usual. A letter posted just the night before. And, of course, the expression on her face." The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. "You noticed that too?" Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, yes. It was not the face of someone who simply collapsed. She was surprised, perhaps even frightened." Graves leaned forward. "You think she saw her killer?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead she said, "Has the cause of death been determined?" Graves hesitated. "The doctor believes it was a heart attack. No immediate signs of struggle, no visible wounds. But the way she was found, It doesn't sit right with me." Miss Marple understood. A woman who died of natural causes would not usually be found sprawled across the floor with a look of shock frozen on her face. "I take it the tea was tested?" she asked mildly. Graves gave her a sharp look. "It's being analysed now." Miss Marple nodded. "Poison is always a possibility, though a subtle one." Graves tapped his fingers on the table. "I'll be blunt, Miss Marple. If she was murdered, it wasn't by an outsider. There's no sign of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. This was someone she knew." Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "In a village like this, Inspector, that narrows it down to nearly everyone." Graves let out a short chuckle. "Unfortunately, yes." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, her mind already sifting through the possibilities. A woman who felt watched. A posted letter to a solicitor. A look of terror at the moment of death. Yes, something was very wrong, and someone in Little Mayfield knew exactly why. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By the following morning, Little Mayfield was buzzing with whispered speculation and uneasy glances. The mystery surrounding Mrs. Letitia Blackwell's death had taken firm root in the village, and the realization that it was no simple passing in the night had left many on edge. Miss Marple, however, remained as composed as ever. She had seen such unease before. When a small insular community was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that one of their own might be a killer. And now, as she stood by the front window of her cosy cottage, watching the early morning mist drift lazily over the rooftops, she considered what she had learned thus far. Mrs. Blackwell had posted a letter to a solicitor the night before her death. She had recently expressed a feeling of being watched. She was found with a look of shock on her face, suggesting she saw her killer. The teacup beside her body might have been poisoned. She did not have enough pieces yet to see the full picture, but she did know one thing. The true answer lay within the village. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She moved to open it, finding Inspector Graves standing there, his expression serious. "Good morning, Miss Marple. May I come in?" "Of course, Inspector. Tea." Graves gave a tired nod, stepping inside. "Thank you. I could use it." She led him to the sitting room, where the fire burned cheerfully against the morning chill. As she poured the tea, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I need to ask your thoughts on something," he said. "We've started speaking with the people closest to Mrs. Blackwell, and I believe we may already have a suspect." Miss Marple raised a delicate eyebrow. "Indeed?" Graves exhaled. "Mr. Lawrence Simmons, the pub owner." Miss Marple hid her amusement behind her teacup. "Ah, yes. I heard about his disagreement with Mrs. Blackwell last week." Graves nodded. "More than a disagreement, it seems. The argument got rather heated. She threatened to have the pub shut down over noise complaints. He, in turn, was heard shouting that she'd regret it." Miss Marple set her teacup down gently. "And so, the village has decided he is guilty." Graves let out a sigh. "It's convenient, isn't it? A public argument, an angry outburst, and now the woman turns up dead." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I do find that in cases such as these, the obvious suspect is very rarely the true culprit." Graves gave her a knowing look. "That's precisely why I came to you." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already shifting through possibilities. "Have you spoken to Mr. Simmons?" Graves nodded. "He denies everything, of course. Claims he'd never harm an old woman over something so trivial. And here's the thing, Miss Marple, he has an alibi." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Oh!" Graves leaned back. "He was at the pub until well past midnight. He had a full bar of witnesses." Miss Marple tapped her finger lightly against her saucer. "Which means he could not have been the one at Willow Cottage." Graves nodded. "That's what I'm thinking. But the village, well, they love a simple answer." Miss Marple smiled knowingly. "Indeed, they do. But I suspect the truth will be far more complicated. A second suspect emerges." After the inspector left, Miss Marple took a stroll through the village. It was a bright morning, the kind that would normally bring about pleasant chatter and laughter. But today the air felt heavier. She was on her way to the bakery when she spotted Miss Beatrice Henderson, the schoolteacher, standing just outside the churchyard. Miss Henderson was not one for idle gossip, but she had a keen mind, and Miss Marple had learned that such minds often noticed things others overlooked. "Good morning, Beatrice," Miss Marple greeted kindly. Miss Henderson turned, her expression troubled. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a terrible business this is." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, it has shaken the village." Miss Henderson hesitated. "There's something I feel I should mention. I didn't think much of it at first, but now—" Miss Marple waited patiently. Miss Henderson took a breath. "Mr. Timothy Blackwell." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Mrs. Blackwell's nephew?" "Yes. He was in the village just 2 days before she died." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I was not aware of that." Miss Henderson glanced around before lowering her voice. "He rarely visits, you know. Not on good terms with his aunt, I believe. But I saw them speaking outside her cottage. She looked distressed." Miss Marple considered this. Timothy Blackwell was Mrs. Blackwell's only living relative. He had left Little Mayfield many years ago and was said to have struggled financially. "Did you hear any of the conversation?" she asked gently. Miss Henderson shook her head. "Only a little. She said something about not making the same mistake twice. And he seemed angry." Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities. If Mrs. Blackwell had changed her will, as the letter to the solicitor suggested, then Timothy Blackwell would certainly have had a motive. "Do you know if he's still in the village?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Henderson frowned. "I don't believe so. He left the day before her death." Miss Marple nodded. "That was interesting. Very interesting." A private conversation with the inspector. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where she found Inspector Graves reviewing his notes. "I have a name for you, Inspector," she said, as she settled into the chair across from him. Graves looked up. "Oh? Timothy Blackwell." Graves straightened. "Her nephew?" Miss Marple nodded. "He was in the village just before she died. They were seen arguing, and given that she wrote to a solicitor that evening, I would wager a guess that she was changing her will." Graves let out a slow breath, which would mean he had a reason to stop her. Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely." Graves stood, already reaching for his coat. "I'll put in a call to London. If he's still there, we'll find out soon enough." Miss Marple smiled, though she knew that things were rarely so simple. Suspects were beginning to emerge. but something still nagged at her. A piece of the puzzle that had yet to fit, and she had a feeling that the real answer was still waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The village of Little Mayfield had settled into a strange sort of stillness. The shock of Mrs. Blackwell's death had not yet faded, but a kind of fragile normality was attempting to return. Women still gathered at the Bluebell Tea Room, men still lingered outside Pritchard's grocer's, and the post office remained as busy as ever with letters and parcels. But beneath the surface, unease lurked in every corner. Everyone had an opinion. Some still believed Mr. Lawrence Simmons, the pub owner, had the strongest motive, despite his alibi. Others whispered about Timothy Blackwell, the estranged nephew whose sudden visit before his aunt's death had raised questions. Yet Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, knew better than to assume. She had learned long ago that murder was rarely as simple as it seemed. An unexpected visitor. That afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her cosy sitting room, knitting a particularly delicate pattern, a soft knock sounded at her door. She rose, smoothing her cardigan, and opened it to find Mrs. Radcliffe, the village seamstress, standing on the threshold. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Radcliffe said in a hushed voice, glancing over her shoulder. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly, stepping aside to let her in. Mrs. Radcliffe entered hesitantly, clutching her handbag as though it contained something precious. She perched on the edge of the sofa, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Don't know if I ought to be here," she murmured. Miss Marple poured a fresh cup of tea and handed it to her. "If you are here, then it must be something important." Mrs. Radcliffe took a shaky breath. "It's about Mrs. Blackwell's house." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she felt a flicker of interest. "Go on." Mrs. Radcliffe hesitated, then leaned forward. "I was walking past Willow Cottage yesterday evening. The police were still inside, of course, but I happened to glance through the sitting-room window." She paused, lowering her voice further, "and I saw something that shouldn't have been there." Miss Marple set down her tea. "What was it?" Mrs. Radcliffe swallowed. "A piece of fabric. Blue silk." Miss Marple blinked. "Silk!" "Yes, a torn fragment of it, caught on the edge of Mrs. Blackwell's writing desk." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. "And why does that concern you, my dear?" Mrs. Radcliffe exhaled slowly. "Because I recognize that fabric, Miss Marple. I worked with it just last week, and I know exactly who was wearing it." Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. "And who was that?" Mrs. Radcliffe's voice was barely above a whisper. "Clara Russell." "Who is Clara Russell?" Miss Marple's mind immediately turned to Clara Russell, a relatively new resident in Little Mayfield. A widow in her early 50s, Mrs. Russell had moved to the village just a year ago, taking up residence in a charming little house near the church. She was well liked, known for her refined manners and quiet nature. But Miss Marple had always sensed something guarded about her. A carefulness in her words, a hesitancy in her movements, as though she carried a secret she did not wish to share. Now it seemed she was connected to the crime. After Mrs. Radcliffe had left, Miss Marple wasted no time. She needed to know more. And so, that afternoon, she made her way to the Bluebell tea room, knowing that Mrs. Russell often took tea there at precisely 4 o'clock. Sure enough, when she arrived, Clara Russell was already seated at her usual table by the window, stirring a cup of Earl Grey with slow, deliberate movements. Miss Marple approached with a warm smile. "My dear Mrs. Russell, what a pleasant surprise!" Clara looked up, blinking in mild surprise. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you! Do sit down." Miss Marple took the offered seat. A pot of fresh tea was brought over, and the two women exchanged pleasantries. It wasn't until their second cup that Miss Marple steered the conversation. "Were well acquainted with Mrs. Blackwell, were you not?" Clara hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around her teaspoon. Well, I knew her, of course. One knows everyone in a village like this." Miss Marple nodded. "And you visited her home from time to time?" There it was, a slight flicker in Clara's expression, too quick for most to notice, but Miss Marple was not most people. Well, once or twice," Clara admitted. "She asked for some help with paperwork, you see. I was happy to oblige." Miss Marple let the silence stretch between them before asking, "And when was the last time you saw her?" Clara hesitated, just for a second too long. "The day before she died," she said finally. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, and how was she?" Clara gave a small, nervous laugh, the same as always, strong-willed and opinionated. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Did she seem troubled? Again, that flicker of hesitation. I wouldn't say troubled, perhaps a little preoccupied." Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "Did she happen to mention a letter to a solicitor?" Clara's hand froze mid-motion. It was slight, just the barest of pauses, but it was enough. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, my dear, you mustn't look so startled. It's quite a small village, after all. News travels." Clara let out a breath, but Miss Marple did not miss the way her fingers trembled slightly. Miss Marple changed the subject, steering the conversation toward less pressing matters. But as they chatted, she watched Clara carefully, and by the time they parted ways, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. Clara Russell was hiding something, and it had something to do with the blue silk fabric left behind in Mrs. Blackwell's home. Miss Marple's thoughts. Before bed that evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she ran through everything she knew so far. Mr. Simmons, the pub owner, had an argument with Mrs. Blackwell, but had an alibi. Timothy Blackwell, the nephew, was seen arguing with her and had possible financial motives. Mrs. Blackwell wrote to a solicitor the night before her death. She felt watched. A fragment of blue silk was found in her home, belonging to Clara Russell. Clara Russell admitted visiting Mrs. Blackwell before she died, but seemed nervous. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she settled beneath her quilt. Yes, the picture was becoming clearer. But she had the distinct feeling that the true answer still lay just out of reach. For now. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The next morning, Miss Marple awoke with a clear sense of purpose. The discovery of the blue silk fabric and its connection to Clara Russell had provided her with a fresh thread to pull, and as she well knew, once you started pulling, secrets often unravelled in the most unexpected ways. Dressing neatly in a powder blue cardigan and a practical tweed skirt, she pinned on her favourite brooch and set off toward the village green. The sun had barely risen, but already little Mayfield was stirring. Outside Pritchard's grocer's, a few villagers loitered, discussing the ongoing investigation in hushed tones. Miss Marple, as always, listened carefully without appearing to do so. "Mark my words," Mr. Pritchard muttered to old Tom Briggs, the handyman. "It's that nephew, Timothy Blackwell. Always had a shifty look about him." Old Tom rubbed his jaw. "Aye, maybe. But I heard Miss Henderson say something about that widow woman, Mrs. Russell." Pritchard's eyes narrowed. "Her? What's she got to do with it?" Old Tom lowered his voice. "Word is, she was seen at Willow Cottage just before Mrs. Blackwell died. Miss Marple, walking past at that very moment, merely smiled to herself. Gossip moved faster than a summer storm in Little Mayfield. But today she intended to do more than listen. A visit to Clara Russell. With measured steps, Miss Marple made her way toward Mrs. Russell's cottage, a charming little house with a white picket fence and a neatly tended garden. She knocked twice. A moment later, the door opened, and Clara Russell appeared, dressed in a soft grey cardigan over a lavender dress. Her face, however, was not as calm as usual. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What a surprise." "Not such a surprise, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was just passing and thought I might call on you." For a fraction of a second, Clara hesitated before stepping aside. "Of course. Do come in." Miss Marple entered the cosy sitting-room, where a half-drunk cup of tea sat on the table, next to an embroidered handkerchief, monogrammed CR. Miss Marple took her usual unhurried approach. She let Clara pour the tea, chatted about village matters, and only when the moment was right did she strike. "My dear, I hope you won't mind me asking, but I have been thinking about Mrs. Blackwell's passing." Clara's fingers tensed around her cup. "Oh? Yes, it's so very sad. And yet I do find it odd that a fragment of blue silk was found in her sitting-room." For the briefest moment, Clara's entire body stiffened. It was so subtle that an ordinary person might have missed it. Miss Marple, however, was not ordinary. Clara let out a nervous laugh. "Blue silk? I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "Oh, but you do, my dear. Mrs. Radcliffe recognized the fabric. She worked with it last week, you see, on a dress for you." Silence stretched between them, before asking, "And when was the last time you saw her?" Clara hesitated, just for a second too long. "The day before she died," she said finally. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, and how was she?" Clara gave a small, nervous laugh. "The same as always. Strong-willed and opinionated." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Did she seem troubled?" Again, that flicker of hesitation. I wouldn't say troubled, perhaps a little preoccupied." Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "Did she happen to mention a letter to a solicitor?" Clara's hand froze mid-motion. It was slight, just the barest of pauses. But it was enough. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, my dear, you mustn't look so startled. It's quite a small village, after all. News travels." Clara let out a breath, but Miss Marple did not miss the way her fingers trembled slightly. Miss Marple changed the subject, steering the conversation toward less pressing matters. But as they chatted, she watched Clara carefully, and by the time they parted ways, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. Clara Russell was hiding something, and it had something to do with the blue silk fabric left behind in Mrs. Blackwell's home. Miss Marple's thoughts. Before bed that evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she ran through everything she knew so far. Mr. Simmons, the pub owner, had an argument with Mrs. Blackwell, but had an alibi. Timothy Blackwell, the nephew, was seen arguing with her and had possible financial motives. Mrs. Blackwell wrote to a solicitor the night before her death. She felt watched. A fragment of blue silk was found in her home, belonging to Clara Russell. Clara Russell admitted visiting Mrs. Blackwell before she died, but seemed nervous. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she settled beneath her quilt. Yes, the picture was becoming clearer. But she had the distinct feeling that the true answer still lay just out of reach. For now, Chapter 6, Confrontations and Secrets. The next morning, Miss Marple awoke with a clear sense of purpose. The discovery of the blue silk fabric and its connection to Clara Russell had provided her with a fresh thread to pull, and as she well knew, once you started pulling, secrets often unravelled in the most unexpected ways. Dressing neatly in a powder blue cardigan and a practical tweed skirt, she pinned on her favourite brooch and set off toward the village green. The sun had barely risen, but already Little Mayfield was stirring. Outside Pritchard's grocer's, a few villagers loitered, discussing the ongoing investigation in hushed tones. Miss Marple, as always, listened carefully without appearing to do so. "Mark my words," Mr. Pritchard muttered to old Tom Briggs, the handyman. "It's that nephew, Timothy Blackwell. Always had a shifty look about him." Old Tom rubbed his jaw. "Aye, maybe. But I heard Miss Henderson say something about that widow woman, Mrs. Russell." Pritchard's eyes narrowed. "Her? What's she got to do with it?" Old Tom lowered his voice. "Word is, she was seen at Willow Cottage just before Mrs. Blackwell died." Miss Marple, walking past at that very moment, merely smiled to herself. Gossip moved faster than a summer storm in Little Mayfield. But today she intended to do more than listen. A visit to Clara Russell. With measured steps, Miss Marple made her way toward Mrs. Russell's cottage, a charming little house with a white picket fence and a neatly tended garden. She knocked twice. A moment later, the door opened, and Clara Russell appeared, dressed in a soft grey cardigan over a lavender dress. Her face, however, was not as calm as usual. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What a surprise!" "Not such a surprise, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was just passing and thought I might call on you." For a fraction of a second, Clara hesitated before stepping aside. "Of course. Do come in." Miss Marple entered the cosy sitting-room, where a half-drunk cup of tea sat on the table, next to an embroidered handkerchief. Monogrammed CR, Miss Marple took her usual unhurried approach. She let Clara pour the tea, chatted about village matters, and only when the moment was right did she strike. "My dear, I hope you won't mind me asking, but I have been thinking about Mrs. Blackwell's passing." Clara's fingers tensed around her cup. "Oh? Yes, it's so very sad. And yet I do find it odd that a fragment of blue silk was found in her sitting room. For the briefest moment, Clara's entire body stiffened. It was so subtle that an ordinary person might have missed it. Miss Marple, however, was not ordinary. Clara let out a nervous laugh. "Blue silk? I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "Oh, but you do, my dear. Mrs. Radcliffe recognized the fabric. She worked with it last week, you see, on a dress for you." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Clara exhaled, placing her cup down with trembling hands. I did visit Mrs. Blackwell," she admitted, "but I swear I had nothing to do with her death." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing Clara to unburden herself. "Went to see her the evening before she died," Clara continued. She had written to me, asking me to come." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "She wrote to you?" "Yes." Clara swallowed. She said she had something to confess. Miss Marple's hands folded neatly in her lap. "And did she?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "She told me that she had made a terrible mistake years ago, one that had haunted her ever since." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did she say what this mistake was?" Clara shook her head. "No, she was about to, but then she stopped herself. She just kept saying, 'I should have done the right thing. But now it's too late.'" Miss Marple let the words settle. Mrs. Blackwell had wanted to confess something she had hidden for years, and then, before she could, she had died. Coincidence? Miss Marple very much doubted it. A secret, long buried that evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Reverend Clement. The vicar had always been a keeper of secrets, and if anyone knew about Mrs. Blackwell's past, it would be him. She found him in his study, surrounded by old parish records. He looked up in surprise as she entered. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "what brings you here?" She sat gracefully in the chair opposite his desk. "I was wondering, Reverend, if you recall any unusual events in Mrs. Blackwell's life. Something from long ago. Perhaps something she might have regretted." Reverend Clement frowned thoughtfully. "Well, there was one matter, but it was many years ago." Miss Marple waited patiently. The Reverend sighed. "There was a scandal. A child went missing." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. "A child? Yes, a little boy. He was the son of one of Mrs. Blackwell's closest friends. She had been watching him one afternoon, and he disappeared." A chill ran through Miss Marple. "What happened?" Reverend Clement shook his head. "The boy was never found. His parents left the village soon after." Miss Marple felt a familiar tingle of certainty. Mrs. Blackwell had wanted to confess something before she died, a missing child from years ago. And now she was dead before she could say the truth. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Reverend. You've been most helpful." As she walked back home, everything clicked into place. Mrs. Blackwell had harboured a terrible secret. Someone had killed her to keep it buried, and Miss Marple intended to uncover exactly who. Chapter 7. Another Twist. The following morning, Miss Marple awoke with a sense of urgency. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, yet the full picture remained just beyond her reach. She had learned two important things. Mrs. Blackwell had wanted to confess something. Years ago, a child had gone missing under her care, and now Mrs. Blackwell was dead before she could reveal the truth. Coincidence? Highly unlikely. An unexpected discovery. It was still early when Miss Marple made her way toward Willow Cottage. The police had removed Mrs. Blackwell's body, but the house remained sealed off, its windows dark and lifeless. She had almost reached the gate when she saw a familiar figure standing nearby. Inspector Graves. He was speaking with a uniformed constable, his brow furrowed in deep thought. When he spotted Miss Marple, he gave a small sigh, as if resigned to the fact that she would involve herself regardless of his wishes. "Miss Marple," he greeted, crossing his arms. "I assume you're here to observe?" She smiled sweetly. "Oh, just stretching my legs, Inspector. But I must say, I do hope your investigation is progressing." Graves rubbed his temples. "Progressing? Yes. Making sense? No, Miss—" Marple tilted her head. "Oh dear, that sounds troubling." He let out a breath. "We found something last night." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Oh!" Graves motioned for her to follow. He led her around the side of Willow Cottage, toward the small flower garden Mrs. Blackwell had so carefully tended. And there, half buried in the soil, was a tiny silver locket. Miss Marple's breath caught. "A locket?" Graves nodded grimly. "It was found buried near the rose bushes, seems old, and when we pried it open, he handed her the delicate piece of jewellery. Inside, encased in a tarnished silver frame, was a faded photograph of a young boy." Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly. A missing child, a secret confession never made, and now this. She turned the locket over, searching for an inscription. And there it was, a name, Edward. Miss Marple inhaled slowly. This was it, a name from the past. Miss Marple did not waste time. Within the hour, she was seated once more across from Reverend Clement, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Edward," she said softly, "the Reverend who had been sipping his tea, nearly choked. I beg your pardon?" Miss Marple leaned forward. "The missing child. His name was Edward, wasn't it?" Reverend Clement's expression darkened. "Yes, but how did you—" Miss Marple held up the locket. "Inspector Graves found this buried in Willow Cottage's garden." The Reverend's face paled. "Good Lord!" Miss Marple waited. She knew the Reverend had more to say. Finally he sighed. "Yes, Edward. He was the son of Margaret and Henry Lockwood. A lovely boy, bright, full of life. He was only 5 when he disappeared." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Mrs. Blackwell was watching him. Yes, she had taken him for the afternoon while his mother ran errands. And then he was gone. Miss Marple's mind raced. What did Mrs. Blackwell say happened? The Reverend's expression became pained. She said she had stepped inside to fetch something just for a moment. When she returned, he was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple frowned. "Did they search for him?" "Oh, for weeks. The whole village did. But he was never found." Miss Marple sat back, her fingers tightening around the locket. So, Edward had disappeared. Mrs. Blackwell had lived with that guilt for years. And just as she had decided to confess something, she had been murdered. The timing was too perfect to be accidental. Someone had wanted to keep Edward's disappearance buried, and they had been willing to kill to ensure it stayed that way. Confronting Clara Russell by the afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once more standing at Clara Russell's front door. Clara opened it cautiously. Her eyes filled with unease. "Miss Marple, may I come in?" Clara hesitated, then stepped aside. Miss Marple wasted no time. "You knew Edward Lockwood," she said. Clara's face drained of colour. "What?" Miss Marple held up the locket. "This was found at Willow Cottage, a locket with Edward's picture." Clara stared at it, her breathing uneven. Miss Marple pressed on. "You were at Mrs. Blackwell's house the night before she died. She wanted to confess something about Edward." Clara's hands trembled. I don't—" Miss Marple's voice remained soft but firm. "What did she tell you, Clara?" Clara squeezed her eyes shut. For a moment Miss Marple thought she might refuse to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "She told me Edward never left the house." A chilling silence filled the room. Miss Marple felt her heart quicken. "Go on." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She said she had lied all these years. Edward never wandered off. He died in the house." Miss Marple's breath caught. "How?" Clara shook her head. "She didn't say. She just kept repeating, 'I should have told the truth. I should have done the right thing.'" Miss Marple's mind spun. So Edward hadn't been taken. He had died inside Willow Cottage, and Mrs. Blackwell, overcome with guilt, had covered it up. But now she had been killed before she could say the full truth. Miss Marple exhaled, her mind already working. If Mrs. Blackwell had hidden Edward's death, there was one pressing question left. Who else knew? And more importantly, who had killed her to keep that secret buried? Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. Miss Marple sat in her cottage that evening, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Outside, the village of Little Mayfield was winding down for the night. Chimney smoke curled into the dusky sky. Lamps flickered in the windows, and the sound of distant chatter from the Three Hounds pub carried on the cool breeze. But inside, her mind was racing. She now knew 3 things. Edward Lockwood had not gone missing. He had died inside Willow Cottage. Mrs. Blackwell had covered up his death for years. She was murdered just as she was about to confess the truth. The question was, who wanted to keep that secret buried? A plan to reveal. The killer, Miss Marple, understood human nature better than most. She knew that people could lie, deceive, and manipulate. But there was one thing they could never control: their reactions. And so she devised a plan. That very night she wrote 4 letters. Each one contained the same message. "Meet me at Willow Cottage tomorrow evening at 7. I have important information regarding Mrs. Blackwell's murder." Then she signed it simply, "A friend." The letters were delivered to 4 people. Clara Russell, the woman Mrs. Blackwell had chosen to confide in; Timothy Blackwell, the nephew who stood to gain from her will; Lawrence Simmons, the pub owner with whom she had quarrelled; Reverend Clement, the man who had known about Edward's disappearance. Miss Marple didn't know who would come. But she knew one of them was the killer. The gathering at Willow Cottage. The next evening, the village was cloaked in a heavy fog as Miss Marple made her way to Willow Cottage. She arrived at 10 minutes to 7, slipping inside with a key borrowed from Inspector Graves. The house was cold and silent. its rooms untouched since the murder. Miss Marple settled into a chair in the dimly lit sitting room. Then she waited. The first knock came precisely at 7. Miss Marple stood and opened the door to find Clara Russell standing there, her face pale. "I got this letter," Clara whispered. "What's this about?" "Come inside, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. A moment later there was another knock. This time it was Timothy Blackwell. The nephew looked irritated, glancing around suspiciously. "What's this about, then?" he demanded. "Patience," Miss Marple murmured. "Let's wait for the others." 2 minutes later, Lawrence Simmons arrived. He looked more amused than concerned. "Bit dramatic, this, isn't it?" he said, stepping inside. And finally, at 7:07, the last visitor arrived, Reverend Clement. The vicar looked deeply troubled, his hands clasped tightly. "Miss Marple, I don't understand. All in good time," Miss Marple said, closing the door behind him. The trap is set. Miss Marple led them all into Mrs. Blackwell's sitting room, where the flickering firelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. She took her seat, folded her hands, and smiled gently. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "I know you must be wondering why you're here." Timothy Blackwell crossed his arms. "I'll say, what's this about?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "It's about Mrs. Blackwell's murder, and the truth about Edward Lockwood." A heavy silence filled the room. Then Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know what happened to Edward?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwell was going to confess, wasn't she? But she was murdered before she could." She let her words settle. She watched their faces, their reactions, and then she dropped. "The final blow. The police are exhuming the garden tomorrow." There, that was the test, the moment of truth. The reaction was immediate. Clara gasped. Reverend Clement stiffened. Timothy Blackwell looked confused, but Lawrence Simmons, his face drained of colour, his hands clenched into fists, his breath came sharp and shallow. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes caught it all. She had her answer. Slowly, she turned toward him. "Oh dear," she said softly. "You didn't know, did you?" Simmons stared at her, his face a mask of shock. Miss Marple smiled gently. "You killed Mrs. Blackwell to protect a secret you thought had been buried forever." Silence. Then, with a sudden desperate movement, Simmons lurched toward her, but he never reached her. The door burst open, and Inspector Graves and 2 constables stepped inside. Simmons froze. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his eyes wild with fear. Miss Marple let out a small, satisfied sigh. "Oh, Inspector, how fortunate you happened to be passing by." Graves smirked. "Funny that." Simmons knew he was caught, and in that moment he broke. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he rasped. "She wasn't supposed to dig it up." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Dig what up, Mr. Simmons?" Simmons let out a harsh, broken laugh. "The bones," he whispered. "Edward's bones." A stunned silence filled the room. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She had suspected it, but hearing the truth spoken aloud still sent a shiver through her. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "You'd best start explaining, Simmons." Simmons slumped into a chair, defeated. "She covered it up," he murmured. All those years ago. She told me one night after she had too much sherry. Edward had fallen. She panicked. She buried him in the garden. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And you kept the secret. Simmons let out a hollow laugh. Of course I did. Do you think anyone would have believed she didn't kill him? I would have gone down for it too. She swore me to silence. Inspector Graves shook his head, and then she decided to confess. Simmons nodded slowly. She said she couldn't live with it any more. She was going to the police. Miss Marple sighed. And so you killed her before she could. Simmons buried his face in his hands. She was old. I thought it would look natural. Just a little poison in her tea. Inspector Graves gestured to his constables. Take him away. Simmons didn't resist as they led him out. Miss Marple watched without triumph, without satisfaction, only with a deep, quiet understanding. The case is solved. That night, as Miss Marple returned home, she took one last look toward Willow Cottage. It was over now. Mrs. Blackwell's secrets had been laid to rest, and Edward, poor little Edward, had finally been found. Miss Marple let out a soft sigh. Justice had been served, and in the end, secrets were always meant to be uncovered. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The morning after Lawrence Simmons's arrest, little Mayfield awoke to a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The whispers in the village had shifted from "Who could have done it?" to "Can you believe it was him?" At the Bluebell Tea Room, the gossip flowed freely over steaming cups of Earl Grey and buttered scones. Imagine, all these years, the truth was right under our noses. Miss Parsons, the postmistress murmured. And to think poor Mrs. Blackwell had carried that secret for so long, added Mrs. Holloway, shaking her head. Miss Marple, seated in her usual spot by the window, listened quietly. She knew that the villagers, despite their curiosity, did not fully grasp the weight of what had happened. A woman had been murdered, a child had been buried and forgotten, and a man had spent decades living with a terrible secret. Miss Marple had seen many such tragedies in her time, and they always came back to one simple truth. People underestimated the past, but the past never stayed buried. A conversation with Inspector Graves. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where Inspector Graves sat at his desk, looking more exhausted than usual. "You've had quite the week, Inspector," Miss Marple said with a kind smile. Graves sighed. "That's one way to put it. I suppose I owe you a thank you." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug. "Oh, I'm sure you would have found him eventually." Graves snorted. "I doubt it. Without your little gathering at Willow Cottage, I might still be chasing Timothy Blackwell across London." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It was never Timothy." Graves exhaled. "No, it was always Simmons." He leaned forward. "I spoke to him again this morning. He gave the full confession." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Go on." Graves rubbed a hand over his face. "It was just as you suspected. Edward Lockwood never wandered off. He fell, hit his head on the hearth. Mrs. Blackwell panicked. She was terrified no one would believe it was an accident." Miss Marple nodded. "And so she buried him." Graves gave a grim nod. She confided in Simmons one night, years later, after a few too many drinks. He swore to keep her secret, said he understood why she did it. Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, but inside she knew Simmons hadn't kept the secret for Mrs. Blackwell's sake. He had kept it for his own. Because if the truth had come out, it wouldn't just be Mrs. Blackwell who would have been blamed. Simmons had helped cover it up, and so, when Mrs. Blackwell finally decided to confess, he had acted. He poisoned her. Graves continued. A slow-acting one. Nothing that would arouse suspicion at first. But then, when she collapsed, he staged it, placed the teacup beside her to make it look like she had simply died of old age. Miss Marple sighed. Except he hadn't counted on human nature. Graves frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, Inspector. He underestimated people. He thought no one would notice that Mrs. Blackwell had failed to open her curtains, that she had left the milk untouched, that her expression, one of sheer shock, wouldn't raise questions. Graves gave a tired chuckle. I suppose that's what made him slip up in the end. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Indeed, and once a murderer makes one mistake, the rest follow. Graves shook his head. The only thing I still don't understand is why now? Why did Mrs. Blackwell decide to confess after all these years? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah, well, that, Inspector, is quite simple. She set down her teacup, folding her hands neatly. She was dying. The final piece of the puzzle. Graves stared. What? Miss Marple nodded. Oh, yes. I thought it odd at first. Why, after so many years, would she suddenly decide to confess? Gave a knowing smile. But then I remembered a little detail I heard from Mrs. Radcliffe, the seamstress. Graves frowned. Radcliffe? Yes. She had mentioned in passing that Mrs. Blackwell had lost weight recently, that she had stopped attending social events. And then, of course, there was the letter. Graves' eyes narrowed. The letter she sent to the solicitor. Exactly, Miss Marple said. She was putting her affairs in order. She let that sink in before continuing. Mrs. Blackwell knew she didn't have much time left. Perhaps it was an illness, or perhaps she simply felt it. Some people do, you know. Either way, she did not want to die carrying that terrible secret. Graves exhaled. And that's why she called Clara Russell. Miss Marple nodded. She wanted to tell someone, to cleanse her soul before it was too late. But poor Mrs. Blackwell. She forgot that secrets do not belong to just one person. She gave a pointed look. They belong to everyone who keeps them. Graves let out a low whistle. And Simmons? He wasn't ready for that truth to come out. Miss Marple smiled sadly. No, and so he did what so many do when faced with exposure. He silenced her. She sighed. But, as we have seen time and time again, Inspector, murder solves nothing. Graves chuckled. Not when you're in town, at least. Village returns to normal. 2 days later, the village of Little Mayfield finally returned to a fragile sense of normalcy. The police had removed the crime scene barriers from Willow Cottage. The newspaper carried a short but scandalous article about Simmons's arrest. The villagers, while still shaken, began to settle back into their routines. At the Bluebell Tea Room, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Hartley, enjoying a warm slice of Victoria, sponge, "You're remarkable, you know," Mrs. Hartley said, shaking her head. "I still don't know how you do it." Miss Marple smiled, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "Oh, my dear, it's really very simple." Mrs. Hartley leaned forward. "Do tell." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "People always tell you the truth." She picked up her teacup. "They just don't always realize they're doing it." And with that, she took a sip of her tea, while outside the village of Little Mayfield carried on, as if nothing had ever happened. But of course, something had happened, and for those who had buried secrets, they had learned the most important lesson of all: nothing stays hidden forever. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The village of Little Mayfield had returned to its usual rhythm. Almost. The streets were still filled with whispers, and Willow Cottage, though now empty, still carried an air of unease. The truth had been laid bare, but the scars of secrets long buried would take time to fade. Miss Marple, however, had already moved on. She knew that once a mystery was solved, there was little use in dwelling on the past, but that did not mean she had forgotten. No, she remembered every detail: the murder of Letitia Blackwell, the disappearance of Edward Lockwood, the guilt that had eaten away at a woman until she could bear it no longer, and, of course, the desperation of a man who had been willing to kill twice to protect the truth. Miss Marple knew that such crimes were never committed in isolation. There was always a chain of consequences, and now the village would have to live with them. A walk through the village on, the morning after Simmons was taken away, Miss Marple took her usual stroll through the village. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue, and the world had the audacity to go on as if nothing had happened. She passed the Bluebell Tea Room, where a few villagers were already deep in discussion. "I suppose we should have seen it coming," Miss Parsons, the postmistress, was saying. "A terrible business, Mrs. Holloway," the vicar's wife added solemnly. Old Tom Briggs, who had overheard, let out a snort. "Aye, well, ain't no one truly innocent in this town, is there?" Miss Marple smiled to herself. Wise words indeed. She continued past the churchyard, where Reverend Clement stood, lost in thought. He noticed her approach and gave a tired smile. "Miss Marple." "Good morning, Reverend," she greeted. "You seem troubled," he sighed. "It's just Edward. After all these years, he's finally been found." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and now he can be laid to rest properly." The Reverend hesitated. "Do you think Mrs. Blackwell was truly remorseful in the end?" Miss Marple considered the question. "Yes," she said at last. "But remorse does not erase the past, does it?" The Reverend exhaled. "No, it does not." Miss Marple gave his arm a gentle pat. "But it does allow us to move forward." And with that, she continued on her way. A final visit to Willow Cottage that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself standing outside Willow Cottage, gazing at the closed shutters and the neatly trimmed garden. It was a house that had held many secrets, and now it stood silent. As she lingered, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Clara Russell approaching, her face drawn but calm. "Miss Marple," she said softly. "Mrs. Russell," Miss Marple greeted. "What brings you here?" Clara let out a slow breath. "I suppose I just needed to see it." One last time. Miss Marple nodded. A place like this, full of history, does not let go so easily. Clara hesitated. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if she had confessed sooner? Miss A. Marple studied her. If Mrs. Blackwell had told the truth years ago, then yes, there would have been consequences, she admitted, but perhaps there would not have been a murder. Clara looked away. She was afraid. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. We all are at some point. They stood in silence for a moment before Clara sighed. I'm leaving, Miss Marple. Miss Marple was not surprised. Yes, I thought you might. Clara smiled weakly. I came here looking for peace. Instead, I found a ghost. Miss Marple gave a small nod. And ghosts have a way of demanding to be heard, don't they? Clara took one last look at the house before turning away. Yes, she murmured. I suppose they do. Miss Marple reflects that evening. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. She had solved another mystery. She had found justice for the dead. And yet, the village would never quite be the same. Secrets, she knew, had a way of poisoning people. They festered, grew, took on lives of their own, and when left unchecked, they led to tragedy. Mrs. Blackwell had paid the price for her silence. Lawrence Simmons had paid the price for his fear, and Edward Lockwood, sweet little Edward, had paid the highest price of all. Miss Marple sighed. It was always the innocent who suffered most. She picked up her knitting once more. The world had moved on, and so she would too. After all, there would always be another mystery waiting just around the corner, and when it came, she would be ready. The end.